3 decades and 3 years ago, President George H.W. Bush signed a piece of paper that changed the landscape in our country for people with disabilities. The ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, laid the groundwork for removing barriers to full participation in American life for many who felt left on the sidelines of this society. John Croman today reached out to people who've been on the front lines fighting for accessibility. Hey, John.
Hey, Jana. You know, the ADA is definitely a milestone in removing roadblocks people face trying to integrate fully into their communities and this economy. And it's a fight that continues to this day in politics and the courts.
Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down.
When President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, he created an expectation in federal law that the public and private sector would remove barriers. Care stories done at the time focused on physical barriers that persons who use wheelchairs face, but the ADA went well beyond that.
And that was very much it, right? Ramps into the buildings and elevators and bathrooms you could at least get your wheelchair in. But then we realized, well, that's a very just scratching the surface of actual accessibility, right? Sorry, I'm going downhill.
Nikki Villavicencio is a Maplewood City Council member and chair of the Minnesota Council on Disabilities.
Nowadays, when we think of accessibility, it's like, how am I going to live in that community? How am I going to get around once I live there, and how am I going to work?
It was 12 years ago that Nikki and her husband Daryl
We are now in recess.
created a disruption in the Senate chambers and were escorted out of the Capitol building by the Minnesota State Patrol. Their point was to get more funding for personal care attendants.
And all we want is to get up in the morning and get dressed and go out down the street.
Nikki and Daryl have managed to live independently and raise their daughter Allie, in part with supportive services called for in the ADA.
It means in my work life, in my public life, in my private life, I have the right to live as closely comparative to a non-disabled person.
You know, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm an attorney, I'm a friend. I feel like I'm all those things before my disability.
Chad Wilson, seen here with his family, is an attorney with the Minnesota Disability Law Center, where the battle to uphold the spirit of the ADA continues.
We advocate for people with disabilities to access the necessary supports and services they need to live in their most integrated setting in the community so they can live where they want to live.
The Disability Law Center last year won a large case for Barry Siegel, an accountant who is often missed by Metro Transit buses or struggled to get his service dog aboard.
That case was brought because Mr. Siegel, who identifies as deafblind, produced evidence showing that Metro Transit failed to let him on board buses more than 150 times.
As a result of the Siegel settlement, Metro Transit created a new training video for drivers showing them where they need to stop for persons who are visually impaired. It was one of many examples of how Minnesotans often have turned to the courts to bring full compliance with ADA.